Today we're going to talk about two critical components in upgrading your Willys Jeep system. Number one is the 12V alternator. Number two is the alternator bracket. Now if you're running a bone stock Jeep, you've got the stock radiator with the mechanical fan. You've got a carburetor on your Jeep. Of course, mine is the aftermarket Solex carburetor, the holy grail of aftermarket. I don't know why, but this is the only one in the world I know that has actually worked for about 15 years. Never once let me down. But anyways, if you're running just a basic simple Jeep, you probably don't need to upgrade to an alternator. I mean, the stock system is more than fine. This Jeep is actually running on a 12V system, so the stock generator, which you can see right here, has been rewired to run 12V. And of course, it's got the wires that go into a voltage regulator box. Now this box tells the generator how much charging amperage to send to the battery, if it's dead or not dead, etc. So this is just what a standard stock Willys Jeep system uses. Again, totally adequate for most applications. I do believe this Jeep's running a 1/2 inch wide belt. I think stock is supposed to be 5/8 inch wide. If you look at the pulley right here, the belt is sitting down there pretty far, but just something to watch out for on your own Jeeps. Now if you're like me and you're playing on the wild side of modifying your Jeep, I've got fuel injections, I've got 2 electric fans, I've got underglow, I've got light whips, I've got all kinds of electrical load. I have to have a 12V alternator because there's not a stock Willys generator that will even keep up with the amount of amperages that I'm running through the system. So that brings us back to this little section right here. I'm going to go through my experiences of alternators and 12V conversion kits to what I'm finally ending up with. From my past experience, I'm going to say buy once, cry once is the perfect saying for this situation. I definitely tried to cheap out originally when I built the Jeep in buying one of these, just a generic alternator off the shelf. Most aftermarket alternators are based on a GM system. There's different styles of GM alternators. Like you can look at the body of this one, a little bit more vented in the back end, different style fan on here. This one's a little bit more closed up, so this would be a little bit more modern version of a GM, but they're all relatively the same. And then the one on the left, I believe, is out of like a Pontiac Fiero, something like that. And I bought one of these cheap junk eBay alternator brackets. Now I know Kaiser Willys sells these with their alternator kits and a few other places, and these are just a universal setup. You see it's nothing but a bunch of angle iron and holes. So the idea for this company that builds them, you know, it's just some no-name generic company online that sells them to all these parts suppliers. But the thought is that you can use this in multiple cars because you can space the bottom brackets in and out with the different bolt holes, as well as the top bolt holes for the alternator. So as you can see right here, you can kind of slide your alternator through there, add spacers as you will to make everything work. So why does this not work in the Jeeps? Number one, because there are predetermined holes, you can never get the perfect setting in these things. As you can see on mine, I've actually grounded out in the center right here and ground out here just to try sliding them back and forth. The biggest problem you have is when you go to bolt these things down, the legs warp inwards, and then once you go to tighten your alternator, obviously you'll have a spacer in here of some sort, but still every time you tighten it, these legs warp in and out, and it's just a miserable nightmare because you get all this thing set up, you got it lined up on your engine to where your belt's nice and straight, you weld it all together, then you bolt it up and it warps and it throws the whole alternator out of alignment. Not only does it go out of alignment side to side, but angles as well. I mean, you think the belt's straight this way, and then you look at the alternator, it's sitting crooked like this, and it's just absolutely awful. I cannot trash this bracket enough. I'm throwing this thing in the dumpster when I'm done with this video. One of the biggest downfalls of this junk bracket is not the bracket itself, but the fact that it mounts on the stock Willys generator mounting system. As you can see on this bracket, you have 2 bolts for the stock generator, one here, one here. They've got huge holes inside these brackets. Then they use a rubber bushing to narrow down the size of the hole. And what you end up with from the factory is this shoulder bolt right here, which is smooth on this side. Then the bolt gets smaller over here with the threads going through it. So it looks like that once it's all pressed in. Why in the world they've got these things on rubber mounted bushings on an item that gets twisted side to side with lots of tension with the belt on it is just a bad design, because those rubber grommets allow everything in the system to move around freely when it needs to be nice, straight, and true to work with your belt setup. This right here is the holy grail of alternator brackets for the Willys L134 and F134. Here's a little screenshot of the website here. Classic Military Vehicles is where I purchased it. As you can see, there is the bracket right there. There's everything assembled and then installed on the Jeep. So again, that's at Classic Military Vehicles. Now, why is that so much better than the other bracket? Well, for one, this is designed to work perfectly with the Willys engine. There's no ghetto slots and adjustment. You don't need a pencil grinder, welder, anything like that. I believe this bushing is made out of aluminum, and what it does is it slides right into that stock little hole right there. I'm probably going to have to tap it in with a mallet just a little bit, but that is a good tight fit into that giant hole, and it's going to make a solid mounting position. There is no more worrying about these rubber grommets that are just flexing all over the place and these goofy shoulder bolts. You get rid of all that with this little piece of aluminum. Looking side by side of this junk eBay bracket versus the one that's purpose built for the Willys Jeep, I mean, it's just no comparison. And one thing to really note is if you look at this alternator adjustment bracket, notice how it's nice and curved. So as you adjust your alternator, nothing comes into contact with the top. Most people that use this bracket, myself included, use a stock Willys generator adjustment bracket. And the problem is once the alternator is angled so far, the bracket starts to hit the body of the alternator, and it's just not designed for working with this system. So that's the benefit of having the nice curve. One thing that people probably don't consider when doing an alternator swap is that the Willys Jeep only revs out, personally looking at my tachometer, at 33 to 3500 RPM, it sounds like it's going to explode. And for most cars, that's just your cruising RPM. The Willys, if you're going out on a trail just putzing around, you're at like 1500 RPM, 1200, 1500. So you're basically turning a third cruising out on the trail versus a car going down the road. And that is a huge problem for alternators because the more that they spin, the more they charge, right? Well, this thing is used to spinning 3000 RPM on a car. You put it on a Willys, you're only spinning 1200, 1500. Did a quick little search of this alternator that I purchased on eBay last year. You see there are two different versions. There's a 105 amp one, then there's a 65 amp one. Now, I purchased the 105 amp one. Unless they sent me the 65 amp one by mistake, I am not seeing this thing actually putting out 105 amp when it needs to be. Again, Willys Jeeps are cruising at lower PM. At high revs, this thing might be putting out 105, but I can tell you my fans are running maybe 15 to 20 amps a piece. The Holley system, I can't imagine, is really running more than 15 to 20 as well. Plus headlights and stuff, you're talking maybe 45, 50 amps. And I was struggling to keep enough voltage down the trail to run that system. I just watched my voltmeter just dropping over time, and it would not even try to regain unless, I was floored on the Jeep. And even then, flooring the Jeep, trying to keep that charging up, it just didn't last long at all. In my past videos, I've mentioned my alternator problems, not having enough amperage to keep up with all my electrical needs. So they sent me this alternator setup, which huge shout out to them. This thing is wicked. I didn't even know it existed until they sent it to me. And I wish I'd done a little bit more research because this is exactly what I would have purchased before wasting money on these. So this is an MSD Dynaforce Performance alternator. They're definitely pricey, but get this. The amount of money I spent on these two alternators, I could have just had this thing and been done with it. But here I am 3 alternators later still screwing with the system. So buy once, cry once. Just do it right and get it over with. Now they've got 2 different styles of these with different amperage ratings, but I've got this little tag on here. So they set this thing at 14.8 volts. Here's the part number. Idle 2400 RPM. Dyno, you're at 104 amps. And at 7500 dyno RPM, that's 160 amps. So at 2400 RPM, this thing is putting out more amperage than this alternator will at its maximum setting. So you're getting basically a 50% gain in performance going with this setup. At about 1500 RPM on the Jeep, I'm expecting this to put out about 62.4 amps, which is huge. That is more than enough to run my fuel injection, my fans, my headlights, and still keeping up with a 12 volt system. Whereas an alternator that's barely adequate, you might have just enough voltage to kind of run things, but slowly dropping down. This setup is going to maintain those voltage levels when we need them. A huge shout out to Holley. I threw the sticker on the floor in front of the alternator because they're the ones that sent it to me. extremely appreciative that they're helping support this project. Here we have the new alternator bracket all installed. The belt is lined up pretty much perfectly, as good as I can get it anyways. We got the MSD alternator in place, and I gotta say this is one bad unit. There are two halves to the alternator bracket setup. The one that goes in front of the engine plate and the one that goes behind. So the one on the engine plate I bolted right to the engine plate itself, but the one behind I found that my alternator was sticking too far forward. So what I did was I added 4 3/8 washers on the area behind the engine plate to space that bracket further backwards. Now, to do that on the alternator, you have to put 4 of the same washers on the front side of the alternator to help push it back along with the bracket. And in doing so, I've got my belt about as perfect as I think I can get it. You know, maybe with a couple of shims I can get a little bit here and there, but again, V-belts are ultra forgiving on how they're aimed, so that's a benefit on our side. I'm currently running a Dayco 17430 belt, and honestly it's just a little too long for what we're doing. If you look at the alternator in relation to the battery tray, I don't have much room left, maybe a finger, and I'm already maxed out on my alternator adjustment bracket here. So I need to go to the parts store and find a belt that's a little bit shorter in diameter. I'm thinking 1/2 inch to 1 inch potentially. It'd be nice to have this alternator way further out here, just to keep it away from the battery tray. And if you look at this alternator, my only real gripe with it is that the power terminal, the positive, is right on the side rather than on the back. So it's really close to the battery tray. Not that they should ever touch in any scenario, but just something to keep in mind. One thing to note, when doing a 12-volt alternator conversion, our main problem here in the stock engine is the oil line placement. I believe stock this oil line comes straight down off the oil filter. What I would do is take your oil filter and the oil line to a parts store. That way they can find a 45 degree that goes into the oil filter and then out to your oil line. One thing you really need to watch out for is that it rubs on this alternator bracket. So an easy solution is take a piece of fuel line, cut it in half, stick it over this oil line so it'll sit up about here, and then tape it or zip tie it onto the oil line. That way it doesn't slide down, and that's a good way to keep things from rubbing through, because if you leave the oil line rubbing on this bracket, it will eventually rub through. So just something to keep aware.